Two, one. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic podcast, episode 165 today. And I am here with my guest, Charles Bausman. How are you doing today, Charles?
I'm doing great, Welsh. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. So, Charles, how have you been? What have you been doing today? Anything much?
It's a beautiful day. It's sunny. You can feel spring coming out. It's been a blessed day so far. Um, just doing what I do, writing and reading Twitter, which I spend way too much time doing.
What else have you done today? Anything else? Because I know that Moscow is having a bit of a fun, like a big snowstorm at the moment.
Yeah, it's only 2 o'clock in the afternoon here, so I spent the morning catching up on work and hanging out with the family.
Fair enough. What
Went
did
outside a little bit. It's beautiful. It's really nice.
What would you say when you look at Moscow, when you like explore, a lot of the snow stuff there that you really love about Moscow, you really enjoy about it?
You mean like the recreation, or like just the atmosphere when it
Yeah,
snows?
the atmosphere, especially in the winter, you know.
Yeah, people don't appreciate this so much, but when everything's covered with snow, there's a huge amount of ambient light. It's almost like a sunny day in the summer. And so when it's snowy and white, it really lifts your spirits in a funny way, and it makes everything sort of more beautiful and covers up the dirt and the grime of a city. And and if you get outside of Moscow, wow, it's just like a wonderland. And so we love to go, outside of town, cross country skiing, sledding, just walking in the woods in the winter. It's magical. It's really lovely, and I really hope that winter doesn't disappear because of rising temperatures.
What would you say is your favorite like ski resort? What is the best ski resort to go to? And like what is also the best like snow festival to go to in Russia?
I've never been to any of those. First of all, Russia doesn't have any ski resorts anywhere near Moscow because
Oh,
most of European Russia is flat as a pancake. And I grew up skiing in the Rockies and the Alps, and uh, other substantial mountains in New England in the U.S. And um, when I go to these little Russian, I've been to a couple times to these little Russian ski resorts, and they just seem really, really not worth the trouble. But Russia does have some big mountain ski resorts, but I just never been to them. They've got a very famous one down in the Caucasus, around Mount Elbrus. They have them out in the Urals, in the Ural Mountains. And then, of course, the Caucasus countries have amazing ski resorts. I've heard, for example, in Chechnya. I would love to do that. Chechnya has built like this super fancy, top of the line Austrian, Swiss level ski resort for wealthy ski tourists from the Middle East, an Islamic ski resort. So that sounds like fun.
that sounds like a lot of fun. So, Charles, talking about that, let's hear about your background. You're a journalist, you used to work for Russia Insider, and tell us about your background and how you became a journalist. And tell us about your time when you lived in the Soviet Union in the 80s.
Yeah, sure. Actually, those are tied together. So, yeah, I wanted to be a journalist when I was in college, and I managed to wangle myself an internship job in Moscow in 1987, which just was an amazing experience. And I worked for about 2 years in journalism, at a very low level, but it was super interesting because that was like Glasnost, Perestroika, Gorbachev, Reagan visiting, all that stuff. And then I realized that that I think I wanted to do something else. So I went back to business school in the U.S. And then came back and worked in business in Russia in the 90s. And and really, most of my career was in business. I worked in business for about 20 years. Um, And then, uh, completely by accident, really, I in the summer of 2014, I was working in private equity, in agribusiness, investments, and so on. And my job was getting investors from around the world to invest in big Russian agribusiness projects, which was a big deal then. And it obviously completely dried up because the Ukraine crisis had started in January, February of that year, and it looked like there was going to be a European ground war. I mean, and so business completely dried up. I had free time on my hands, and I had always been interested in politics, and that's actually my first love. And I I thought, I just can't sit here and be quiet about what's happening, because I was reading like the Western media, I was reading the Russian media, and I could tell that the Russians are basically telling the truth, and the Western media was lying their asses off. And so I thought what to do, and I did this together with some other expats here, and we're like, we got to say something, we got to do something, we got to try and help avert a war. And so we consider things like taking a full page ad out in the New York Times, the kind of boomer things you might do. And then we thought, well, you know what? Let's put up a website, and and we'll just sound off there. And honestly, I thought this would be something that would be read by 200 people or something. I mean, like friends and family, and just like a small circle. It was just like, I just want to just say my piece, right? And whatever. And the thing completely exploded. And I was a finance guy. Had barely used social media. I uh, knew how to write, but I'd never managed a website or anything like that, like in the news business. So, and it really exploded, and it exploded on Facebook. And it got so big by Christmas of that year that I realized, hey, I could make a business out of this. So that's what I just did for the next 8 years. And it was an amazing experience and the best time I've ever had.
So, when you look at Russia right now, just seeing the economic miracle of that place, of how in the 90s, it was really an economic dump. It was struggling. It was just a third world dump, like a lot of Russians say. It was a terrible time. How do you compare Russia to how it is now compared to when you were there when it was the Soviet Union in the 80s?
Well, it's like an almost miraculous, resurrection, like a rebirth or something. It's unrecognizable. Um, and I think it really goes to show how quickly and dramatically things can change economically if the government is doing the right things, like simultaneously unleashing the power of free enterprise and freedom to make money and create services, and at the same time having government policies that really do help people, like major infrastructure projects, highways, trains, you know, big things that make the economy work. You know, the economy. It's like what you see happening in China and Far East Asia. You just see this explosion of prosperity.
And also, what it was like. You went to Russia in the 90s, right? What was it like Russia was in the 90s, especially when it was very rough?
You know, it was very grim. Just sort of, I mean, I'm talking aesthetically, externally. Um, uh, very very little color. Everything is run down. Everything was shabby. And then there was this kind of total breakdown of social order, where basically, criminal gangs kind of took over everything, and they also took over the police and people who are supposed to keep criminal activity in check. So like everything was just a racket, and it was very corrupt, and there was sort of gang violence, gang wars, assassinations of businessmen was common. Assassination of journalists was common, actually. Um, so everything was just pretty bad. And but I looking back on it all now, I was just so naive and arrogant. I was this like business school guy from America who was going to come and teach the primitive uh, communist Russians how the market works and everything like that. And anyway, so it was a fascinating time, but it was bad, and people were hurting very much. So, I mean, uh, people like me weren't hurting at all because we were getting Western level salaries and we were like, stinking rich in comparison to the Russians barely scraping by. And so looking back on it, it's a bit embarrassing of how just just I just wasn't sensitive to what was going on. But looking back on it, I can see how bad it was.
When you look at Russia right now, it's in a very interesting phase because I was listening to your interview that you did with World War Now, and you guys and the guy on there mentioned a very interesting question, how he talks about how Russia's at a crossroads because Russia doesn't really know politically what it is, in a way, what in his opinion, what he said. And especially like how you'll have some people in Russia who see Russia as a socialist communist country, some people see it as a Russian Federation, or some people still believe it's, should be a monarchy. What is your opinion towards that, especially like when you have like, some places in Russia where they have the three flags next to each other, the Russian Empire flag, the Soviet Union flag, and the Russian Federation flag?
Yes, I completely agree with what that guy said. You know, uh, I believe that a country really has to have an ideology. People have to know what they're striving towards and what the country's moving towards. And having this kind of wishy-washy, well, it's not really clear. Um, I think one Russian commentator said that the actual like ideology that the government here presents to people is just prosperity, prosperity and patriotism. And that's not something to jump out of bed and get excited about. Patriotism is a wonderful thing. I mean, it's one of the greatest human emotions, um, and prosperity is certainly a good thing. But it doesn't have any of the sort of higher spiritual meaning. And in a funny way, communism did provide that, and people really believed that they were making a better world. And I've talked to so many just everyday Russians, and I was like, did you really believe that stuff back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on? And they say, yeah, we did. We really did. We felt that we were the luckiest people in the world. And we felt that we were better than any other country because we were a country of equality, and that we had erased all these social ills that the capitalist West was still struggling with. And we knew we were poorer, and we knew our material standard of living was lower than in the West, but we thought it was worth it because it was fair and equal and just. And we actually felt sorry for people in the West. So and so there really was this kind of like idealistic ideology that motivated people and made them feel good about what they were doing. And I think you really need that in a country. You can't just have, no, buy a new refrigerator, and hey, you can, upgrade your model car in 2 years, and that kind of thing, get a new phone. That's not good. So, yeah, Russia very, very much needs an ideology, and I believe that the only one that makes any sense for her is Orthodox Christian monarchism.
When you I saw that you wrote some very good articles. We'll get back to the Orthodox Christianity in a minute. I saw that you wrote good articles. Explain to me about your article where you wrote about Putin's building boom in Mariupol, Donbass, and also how Russia beats out other countries to migrate to, your reasons. And where would you consider people to go live in Russia?
Yeah, sure. So, that was a super interesting trip. I some military journalists invited me to come down with them and visit the front outside of Donetsk, and then we did a day trip over to Mariupol, which is about 2 hours away, and it was absolutely fascinating because Donetsk is still like a city that's in sort of, well, now it's not so anymore, but even just 3 months ago when I went, it it was still considered closer to the front, and you were sort of battened down, and you felt this military thing, and you just drive 2 hours away to Mariupol, away from the front, and you had this incredible reconstruction project going on, and this enormous confidence there from coming from the local authorities, and the big financial commitments that were coming out of central, Russia, the federal government, and so on. And the city had been heavily damaged in the battle for it in 2022. Not nearly as badly as something you see like in the Middle East, like in you know well, Gaza is like an extreme, but even Syria and places like that,
Mm.
where you see these absolutely like it's like Dresden level destruction. It wasn't like that, but nonetheless, it was substantial. I think they had 3,000 buildings in the city had been damaged from this ongoing month-long fight of rooting the Azov battalion out of there, and they'd rebuilt and renovated 2,000 of those buildings, and some of them they just built from scratch because they weren't savable, and it was extremely impressive and showed an enormous amount of strength and confidence in the future and all sorts of things.
I was also asking, why do you think Russia beats out other countries when it comes to migrate to?
It's a combination of so many things. I one of the big arguments for me is that Russia has such a powerful military. So if you are a pessimist about what is eventually going to happen in the West, in the sense that it's just going to sort of not pull itself together spiritually, it's going to continue to be corrupted by the forces that have been so evident over the last 20, 30 years, and longer, really. It's been going on since, I would say, for the last 150 years, this sort of general decline of morality, and which I link directly to Christianity, right? Decline in Christianity and the rise of anti-Christian forces in society. So, there's really no place to hide. I mean, you can try and hang out in Uruguay if you want and have a farmstead there, or you can go to Southeast Asia, or I don't know where, or just some rural place in America or Canada and so on. But if the society really goes to crap, they're going to find you, just the way they found people in Russia during the revolution. There was nowhere to hide, right? So, um, and Russia is the only country that can really protect you in that sense because they've got this military. I mean, it's Russia is absolutely militarily undefeatable in every way, um, because of their nuclear shield, because of their cutting edge technology, and because it's such a big country. You could never really invade it. I mean, it would just take, I don't know how many tens of millions of soldiers to occupy and pacify Russia, and also because of the personality of Russians. They would fight to the last man. They'd be like the Japanese in World War II, and they'd be like, fighting house to house, and grandmas, and God knows what. I mean, you'd really have to come in on a street to street level and fight with these people with rifles and bullets, and it would be anyway, it's impossible. So, my point is, it's like this it's like this safe haven. It's like a safe space for people who have their heads screwed on straight. And I'm not naive or doing any wishful thinking about the future of Russia. Russia also has to still pull itself out of this horrible sort of globalist morass that sort of engulfed the world over the last 30, 40 years. But at least Russia's doing a much better job than any other country at this point.
Russia is a country, you are correct, for a long, long time. You could argue against the elites of the world ever since the time of the Khazarian Empire, when Russia put an end to the Khazarian Empire, when that was going, I think the Khazarian Empire Kingdom was going around doing horrific things and that's why they hate them. And like, not to mention, Russia also defeated Napoleon, who was a puppet to the elite, and also Adolf Hitler too, who was a puppet to the elite, even though like all that, and especially that's one of the reasons why Russia's been targeted. Um, Charles, when you look at that, when you look at that, how would you say that in what ways Russia's Orthodox faith preserves its plurality and strength, unlike Western Christianity, which is so corrupted by New Age ideology, Talmudic and Satanist thing? Go.
Yeah, well, you see, this comes down to a very important uh, theological view of things, right? Because if you take the view that Orthodox Christianity is the right form of Christianity, and that the Protestants and the Catholics, although there might be some very good Christians among them, are basically wrong, that an Orthodox country that's overtly Orthodox and defending that faith and standing up for it is going to be protected by God, and that good things will happen in that country, and God will protect it, and that if you're pursuing a slightly heretical faith, you're just going to be more vulnerable to the bad things. And I think the reason why Russia is much better off is because they suffered so horribly under the communist experience, and it's almost like like if you would get a terrible illness and then your body would bounce back with like a superhuman kind of immune system. You'd be stronger, right? And you kind of look at Russia that way because the West didn't go through the misery that the Russians did. And then also, the West has been much more prosperous for longer than the Industrial Revolution and the prosperity that came with that was longer and more, and the sort of soulless materialism that it brought with it was much stronger. And the Russians were spared that by their very austere communist years. So is that an accident of history? Is that an act of God? Who knows? But yeah, for all those reasons, and it's a very long conversation, Russia is in a very strong place right now. And if you believe in Christianity and you believe that, or you're willing to allow as a possibility that Orthodox Christianity is the right one in terms of theology, then Russia has a very bright future indeed if it can become truly Christian, which it is not today. And you see the same, sort of struggle in Russia between Christianizing forces and anti-Christianizing forces, and in that way it reflects the West very much.
What was your journey into Orthodox Christianity, and what would you say is your favorite Orthodox Orthodox Christianity like priest or monk that you like really admire throughout history, that you really look up to?
Um, okay, so the way I became Orthodox is again rather sort of by accident and sort of superficially. I read some books, mostly by C.S. Lewis. I became convinced around the age of 35 that, hey, maybe I was wrong about this whole Christian thing. Maybe it actually seems like it might be true. I was living in Russia at the time, and I went down to talk to a local priest about it. He was a super great guy. He's still a good friend today. We're about the same age. He he made the argument that, hey, listen, Orthodoxy is more correct than Protestantism and Catholicism, and I found that pretty convincing. But I didn't really get into the heavy lifting of it. But I thought, well, I'm living in Russia. I want to be able to go to a church anywhere. I don't want to, I want to be part of the Christianity that's here. And so I said, yeah, sure, I'll become Orthodox. And it was kind of like not that deep a thing for me. And then as things transpired, about 15 years later, when I was doing Russia Insider, I wanted to talk more about all this incredibly interesting Christian stuff going on in Russia and this revival of Orthodoxy. So I started a sister site called Russian Faith. And that led me to start reading an awful lot about Orthodoxy and get, as it were, red pilled on it. And that's when I really had this sort of profound realization that, wow, this is really serious stuff, and this is really true. It checks out, and it's amazing, and there's so much depth and truth here, and yeah, and so that's how it happened. It was kind of gradual, but it became eventually very, very powerful and very strong, and it's like the absolute like central uh, pillar around which my life revolves. And and as far as Christian authors or saints or things like that, uh, because I'm a journalist and I'm aware of so many, I find it almost impossible to say which ones are my favorites. But I'm particularly fond of. There was this generation of uh, bishops and priests who were successful authors and popular authors in 19th century Russia and sort of the second half of 19th century Russia. And they wrote these sort of popular books, meant for the masses of like, this is how you lead the spiritual life. This is a good way to live. And this is how to take the faith that you read in the Bible and that you learn about in church and everything, and then really apply it to like your everyday existence. And they did this so well and with such great talent that these books have just become sort of classics of Russian Christian literature, and they're still popular today, very popular today. And these authors were then canonized, and so I can name two authors. One is Brian Cheninov. His first name is Ignati, and the second one is Saint Theophan the Recluse. And I just love reading their books and get so much out of them.
What would you say is your favorite Orthodox Christianity artwork that you really like? Whenever you what like were out of any church you've been to that you look at and you just think, wow, this is incredible.
Well, that question has the same problem because I'm familiar with so many of them. But actually, I think I might. I actually could identify a favorite, and I just tweeted about it, which might be why you're asking about it. Maybe you checked my Twitter feed and saw it. So it's this enormous painting painted in, I don't remember the date because I just tweeted about it, in 1857 by one of Russia's greatest painters ever, Alexander Ivanov. And he worked on this thing for 20 years, and it's absolutely enormous. It's this monumental painting. It's, what is it, 3 yards by 5 yards or something like that. And it's in a museum here in Moscow. And it's called it shows Christ approaching the people who were being baptized by St. John the Baptist in the Jordan. And it's just a beautiful painting. I just love it. So I recommend everybody check my Twitter feed and you'll see what I'm talking about.
I'll tell you, Charles, I really love the Orthodox Christianity like artwork. I think it's absolutely stunning. I've always wanted to go to Russia and see like the beautiful artworks, and I love the Orthodox music. I think Russian Orthodox music is incredible. It is like absolutely beautiful. Like it's just stunning, isn't it? It's just like
Oh yeah,
it really helps with like when it comes to studying like stuff.
yeah. It's extremely appealing, and yeah, just so appealing. That's the best word for it. It just makes you feel good. But I do feel I think this is very important that it's very cultural, right? So it's very Russian, and so I see a lot of people becoming Orthodox in the West, and they're kidding themselves out in every way, like Orthodox Christians do in Russia, and that strikes me as like off key. Like I'm like, no, wait a minute, that's the Russian way to do it. You're not Russian. You should be embracing your own national traditions.
So speaking of that, Charles, one thing I want to mention now, this is a very important thing. As we all know, now you and me obviously have different beliefs to the Russian Revolution, but you're the guest. You're going to have your opinion on it, which is all good. And that's the important thing that matters. So when you look at the state of America, as we know, right now, last year, there was a bill called the Anti Semitic Act, and the Anti Semitic Act, which will basically legalize some Bible quotes, especially when it comes to the quotes where the Pharisees, the Talmudic, juices, sorry, I can't say the word, but, I'm just
Yeah,
saying juices instead of,
right.
Talmudic Jews basically ordered for the killing of Christ, which pretty much, it's going to be illegal to say that, and it's pretty much going to make it illegal. And knowing how Donald Trump is the perfect puppet of the Rothschild banking Talmudic cabal to bring in this law that will turn the United States of Zion into the United States of Zion on steroids. Sorry if I muffle words, just anxiety. I get that. When you look at that, when he will sign that bill, and you look at like the Russian Revolution that happened in your opinion, like how close do you think America, in a way, is? I mean, when you compare it like Donald Trump signing the Anti-Semitic Act, and which will make it illegal, which anti-Semitism was illegal in Russia back then. In what way do you think like America will have its own like revolution, like its own Russian Revolution? Do you see that happening or no?
Um, you know, uh, it's incredibly important for people in the West to be honest about what happened in Russia during and after the revolution, because it is worse than you can ever imagine. Like the only thing I can think of that is comparable is what's happening in Gaza now. Um, but it was so evil and so brutal and so like almost difficult to understand evil, difficult to comprehend evil, um, and uh, and so yes, this could happen in the West if these, as you say, these Talmudic types, get their way, and because that's basically what the people who created the revolution were. But do I think it's likely to happen at this point? I'm not so sure, and I think I'm not. I guess you're very skeptical of Trump. I'm an agnostic about him. I don't. I don't. I'm not naive or don't engage in wishful thinking about what he's doing. But I also can't deny that he's doing some very, very, very good things that you have to take as wins. And I think you just have to, Trump is like the master of, uh, what's that word? Deception, right? He just throws up a lot of smoke, says a bunch of contradictory stuff. Nobody really knows what he's going to do. He loves being unpredictable, and he's deliberately behaves in a way that he is unpredictable. So I don't worry about it too much, or think this. I'm not with the doomers who say he's like, luring people into like a high tech, a Bolshevik concentration camp, and I don't go with the guys who thinks he's going to save the world. I'm just like live one day at a time, and if he does something that's good for me, I take the win. If he does something that's bad for me, I speak up against it. But regarding these anti-Semitism laws, I don't think you're going to have like a really vicious sort of coup or violent takeover to enforce them because they are unconstitutional. And he can go ahead and Congress and the president and whoever can pass on any kind of laws or executive orders they want, but it'll just get challenged in the courts. And I don't see how I think that the much more important truth about America is that we're experiencing this really bizarre episode of free speech, which is driven by technology that nobody knows how to clamp down on, and that survived efforts to clamp down on it, and they failed spectacularly. And this reminds me very much of what happened in Europe in the 1500s with the printing press. And so I think it's kind of the opposite. You've got this era of people being able to say things they never, they weren't able to say and didn't even know about 30, 40 years ago, and that's not going to change soon. Uh, so it would be too widely unpopular to say, hey, you can't criticize Jews anymore, or you can't interpret the Bible, as being critical of Jews or something like that. People just wouldn't stand for it unless you like lined them up and pointed machine guns at them. But I don't kind of see that happening in the near future.
So, talking about that, when you look at the Russian Revolution, when it was happening, when they came into power in Russia, what were the crimes that they were committing that was very Talmudic like, very like satanic? And what other things do you think that people need to know about the Russian Revolution that you won't hear from like any of the Western media and stuff?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that um, sometimes something that happens is so horrible, and I'm sure there's a psychological term for this, that it just doesn't register, and you just kind of shut it out, and you try to stop thinking about it, like shortly after you're made aware of it, because it's so unpleasant to have to face and everything. So, and I think that's very much what happened during and after the Russian Revolution, and these absolute, extreme psychopaths seized power in a military coup and did exactly what I just said. Pointed machine guns at people and said, "Okay, now you're going to do what we tell you to do." And um, they tortured people in the most grisly ways. They crucified them. They, ripped out their fingernails. They performed live vivisection on them. Um, but those were isolated cases of extreme psychopathic behavior. What was perhaps worse was that they brutally murdered millions and millions of people in very cynical ways. Like, for example, they instituted these enormous public works projects in the north. They built the famous Gulag. They sent all kinds of people up there, um, of all political stripes and persuasions, and deliberately worked them to death in freezing temperatures. So the idea was to get some labor value out of them for a couple of years, but also make sure that they then died in the process, got so sick and frail in the process that they died. Um, and and this was mostly a Jewish phenomenon. I mean, the people who ran these camps were Jewish. The secret police that enforced all this was Jewish. Um, and there were, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you could fill an encyclopedia with examples, but after just hearing about 5 or 6 of them, you're like, I just don't want to listen to this anymore. This is just too nauseating. So that's what happened, um, and something like that could happen. That is what will happen in the West, unless the West gets its shit together. Now it looks like it might be doing that. I mean, this whole Trump phenomenon is like a ray of hope. Like, okay, are we going to be able to get out of this? Well, we'll see. Nobody knows, but at least there seems to be a respite, and a pause in this, like, in what seemed to be like disastrous with the Biden administration.
Sleepy Joe, I will admit, I will miss those some of his funny some of his funny moments that were pretty funny. Charles, I know you and me have different opinions to the Russian Revolution, and that's fine. That's all good. But so if I was to come up to you, what would you say to someone right now coming up to you and saying like, "Oh, the Jewish influence in the Russian Revolution is nonsense. It's a load of rubbish. Oh, they weren't all Jews." What evidence would you present to them of like where the Russian Revolution had like Rothschild and J.P. Morgan people, like American Wall Street people backing it? Like, what evidence would you show them, and statistics and stuff to show them that? What would you show them?
Well, first of all, this is like extremely heavily documented. We're not talking about something that happened 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago, where it's sort of harder to figure out. I mean, there's just like extensive documentation of all this stuff. And so, yes, the revolutionaries were predominantly Jewish. Yes, they received funding from, big banking circles in the West, primarily in London and New York. And you can just look at the historical facts of the names of the people who perpetrated these murders. They were mostly Jews. And the Jews were extremely sympathetic to the ideas of revolution that were coming out of Europe at the time. So, I mean, if you want to have a historical debate, the people who are going to be, who are going to say it wasn't Jewish are going to be on the have a very hard time making their case.
Yeah, and also, sorry, I've had a bit of a moment there. What would you say is the most important document to back this up?
I'm a history buff, and so and I read a lot about these sorts of things, and I wouldn't say there's any single document. I would say there are literally, archives full of documents with this stuff, because it was a big national program. I mean, you can go back and get the names of every guy who ran every camp in Russia. You can look at who the major theoreticians were of communism. You can go back to the fact that Marx was Jewish, and that he said some very, very vicious things about Christianity and Russians themselves, and that he was basically psychotic, in a weird way. In fact, there's a lot of documentary evidence to historical evidence to suggest that he actually dabbled in Satanism, like full on Satanism. And so, listen, if you start, I'm not an historian, so I can't point to like a shelf full of documents pointing this out, but I've read the books and I've read the articles, and there's just masses of evidence. And you know what? And you know what interesting is that this is also like an interesting spiritual point. The thing they hated the most, more than anything else, were the Christians, and they saw as their number one goal to destroy Christianity. And Russia was the most Christian civilization in Europe at that time, and had the greatest number of believers among the broad masses of the people, the middle class and the working class and the peasantry. And they were absolutely vicious with this. And what I was mentioning about these atrocities, the kind of atrocities you hear about now in Gaza, right? Like this like insane like IDF weird like it's you just can't even when you hear about it you're like what that's like I almost don't want to I can't believe it it's so bizarre right um, well they were practicing these kinds of things primarily on Christian clerics on bishops like what unleashed their hatred and wrath more than anything else were the Christians and that's this is like heavily documented. There's this whole museum on the edge of Moscow dedicated to this because it was the site of an internment camp in Moscow where hundreds of thousands of priests were shot, executed, tortured, and so on and so forth. Um, and the incriminating thing is they kept records of everything, so you can actually, it's like it's provable by archival documents that have survived to this day. Um, yeah, so that tells you something, right? And so it's a very much, this whole question of is Christianity true or not is just so important because it seems to be that um, Christianity is true, and that the Jews, for whatever historical reasons, are the direct spiritual, if not genetic heirs, but ideological heirs of the people who Christ was criticizing in his day, and that same hatred that they had for him and what he was saying hasn't changed one iota, and that they are uh, when left to their devices, they'll do the same kind of sort of atrocities that they did to Christ on whole populations in order to root out Christianity. So it gets into understanding it. Is very much directly related to faith.
Um, Regarding that, when you look at like the Holocaust and the Holodomor, in your opinion, like I said, you and me have different beliefs to that, but in your view, what facts do you think that people should know about the Holodomor, and how do you view the Holocaust? Like, because I know that a lot of people will say, "Oh, the Holodomor happened." Some people say it didn't, and some people say the Holocaust happened and it did. So, what's your view, and especially, what is your opinion on like the numbers thing, like the numbers, of like all that? So, go.
Okay, so I've read a lot more about the Holocaust than I have about the Holodomor. So just I'll address that first. From what I've been able to read and understand, and I've read an awful lot about this, is that it just never happened, and this was completely a kind of self-replicating sort of lie that emerged not immediately after World War II, but more like in the late 50s and early 60s, and it just gathered steam, and nobody wanted to raise their voice because they would get accused of being anti-Semitic or whatever, and it just sort of like grew into this myth. But that when you go back and you look at the facts, you're like, none of this ever happened. I mean, this is what in the way that you would expect of a myth that kind of grew by inertia over decades and wasn't some sort of carefully crafted lie that somebody invented and then made sure was airtight. It has all the sort of the weaknesses and fallacies of something that is more of like a sort of this sort of organic process that developed over a while and just kind of kept building on itself and becoming more and more ridiculous. So, yeah, and uh, we were before the show we were talking a little bit about well, what about the Yugoslav experience and the Serbs and the Croats and the National Socialist Croats and something. That's a very separate subject, in my opinion. Um, uh, the premise of the Holocaust is that the German leadership, going right up to the top, going up to Hitler, decided, you know what, we've just got to completely exterminate this race. and that's what we're going to do. And so then they came up with a way to do it, and a method and a system, and then they tried to implement it, and as a result, killed 6 million people. That is complete bullshit. Okay. Now, what happened in Yugoslavia was something very different. Uh, that was a long-standing ethnic feud. It was not perpetrated by the Germans. I mean, there might have been some German authorities there who turned a blind eye to it, or were in some ways sympathetic to it, but it was very much, the local historic hatred erupting in a wartime situation and getting completely out of control. And the the casualties in that were in the hundreds of thousands, and it was barbaric and awful in the same way that, for example, the persecution of the Christians in Bolshevik Russia was. But that wasn't the Holocaust. That's not what people are talking about with the Holocaust. What they're talking about is the decision by the German command to eliminate the race of Jews, and that, I think, never happened. So now let me talk about the Holodomor. So I know less about it, and I'm aware that there's arguments on both sides saying, some people saying it was absolutely enormous and it was a complete deliberate plot by the Bolsheviks to basically murder an entire class of people in central Russia and Ukraine. And then the other argument is that it was actually just a fuck up, where these dumb communists came in and had these naive ideas about collectivization of farmland, and when they implemented it, grain and food production just plummeted so dramatically that famine erupted, and it was an unintentional thing. And by the way, not nearly as many people died as as people claim. One thing about famines is it's extremely difficult to identify how many people died, because who's counting, right? A village is suffering from famine, and some children die of hunger, and some old people die of hunger, and so on and so forth, and they get buried, and where's the evidence? How are you ever going to establish that? So it's a much more difficult thing to establish. But because of how vicious I know that the Bolsheviks proved to be towards their enemies, where it is documentable, I'm inclined to believe that there was an element of deliberate, there was an element of deliberate intent here, that there were people who really did see, hey, this could be a really good thing because we can really destroy our class enemies, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so that's my take on that.
Um, One thing I noticed when you were talking to on an interview, you were talking about a very interesting fact about the Russian Empire, and how I'm very fascinated about that. You've studied a lot about the Russian Empire, haven't you? Right, Charles, the Russian
Yes, yeah,
Empire
I have.
and the start.
Yes.
So, what would you say was like the greatest achievement that Nicholas II achieved? What was the greatest achievement that the Russian Empire did for the world and economically? And follow also to add to that, what would you say would have happened if the Russian Empire never fell? If there would never was a Russian Revolution and they had won, World War One. Go.
Yeah, so that's also, this is such a super interesting topic because, after the whole World War II whitewash, the Russian Revolution and uh, what what was going on in Russia and the nature of the Russian Tsarist empire is the second most completely whitewashed and falsified piece of history that has extreme direct relevance on what is happening today, and also has enormous Christian sort of ideological ramifications. Because the basic lie we're told is in school and colleges and in movies and books and so on and so forth is that the reason the Russian Revolution happened was because Tsar Nicholas and his whole ruling system there were just terrible people, and they were corrupt and effete and weak and incompetent, and they did a lousy job running their country and impoverished their people and were tyrannical against them, and these struggling peasants and workers and middle class finally, because of the hardship of World War One, rose up, in outrage and agony, and threw off their evil masters. Well, that turns out to be a complete lie. Surprise, surprise. And again, a lie sold equally well by the people who came into power in Russia, the Bolsheviks, these like super evil people, but also by leftists in the West who basically dominated the media narrative, dominated the universities and Hollywood. And so, and a funny, they were totally in sync with what the Russian communists were saying about the Tsar. And now all this, since the end of communism, there's been this huge amount of scholarship in Russia, historical scholarship, going back and reviewing all this. And it's a lot of it isn't new because a lot of the white Russian immigrants knew this also, and talked about it when they came to Europe and America. Mm, but that knowledge was kind of swept under the rug and never taken up and promoted as a mainstream narrative in society by those three big forces. So what it turns out the truth is that no, actually Russia was a very successful and prosperous country with a basically happy uh, working class and peasant class, and that industrial workers were well paid uh, by international standards, which were good in those days. They had a high standard of living. The peasants too had a high standard of living and were basically, content with their lives. And there was this, flowering of culture and philosophy and painting and music and literature and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and all these things, ballet and all the signs of a flourishing civilization. And it was a very wealthy country, and seemed to have an incredible future ahead of it. And it was growing dramatically, including the population. I think average birth rates, because so much of the population was on the land in these peasant families, and I think average birth rates were something like 8 children per family. And under the reign of Tsar Nicholas, which lasted, it was quite long. I think it was like 20 years, 25 years or something like that. The population grew by 50 million people, which was, as fast as America, basically. And it was like America. It was just very similar, and it was not behind the West technologically. It was not behind America technologically, and it was growing by leaps and bounds. And prosperity was rising, living standards were rising. Were instituting universal schooling and universal health care and addressing social problems ably and efficiently. And then what happened was, what undid Russia was liberal ideologies that were coming from the West. So the Russian upper and middle classes, they traveled freely to the West. There was no passport system then. You could just jump on a train and, 10 hours later you're in Warsaw or Berlin or Paris. And they started buying all this liberal BS, that democracy is the only way to go, and monarchy is anachronistic and repressive and bad, and um, and that what really would be great would be socialism, and religion is stupid, and Christianity is naive, and all this kind of thing. And they became totally infected by this, to the point where during World War One, Russia was actually doing incredibly well. They were poised to march on Berlin, and it was going to be just basically the same thing that happened in World War Two. They had completely outfought and outmanufactured the German army, which was on the ropes. They weren't encountering any kind of social problems or uh, food shortages or social unrest or anything like that. And so, but the British government was aware of this network of extremely liberal-minded uh, circles in Russia that they've been building up for years, and also this had been built up also by sort of Jewish activist groups from London and New York. And they just implemented a color revolution, kind of like, what we've seen happening, done by the by USAID and the State Department and U.S. foreign policy over the last 15 years, where they faked riots, they faked food shortages, they manipulated the media, got people all worked up, and were successful in toppling the government, and basically a sort of color revolution coup. And that's what happened. And the Bolsheviks and the communists had nothing to do with it, because the Russian uh, police had been so effective in stopping their activities that they were all in exile. They were sitting in Europe in exile, or they were in jail in Russia, and so it was a completely bourgeois revolution driven by basically wealthy Russian businessmen and what they call the intelligentsia, like the educated classes, academics, artists, and sadly, very much the church was also completely infected and supported the revolution when it happened. So it was like the whole society had rotted out from the inside and become very brittle, at least the top layers of it, the upper layers. And the Tsar just didn't have any support. The whole society turned on him.
When you look at
There's a lot more to it. I probably shouldn't go on too much longer, but it's just so interesting. And so I'm gonna be talking about this a lot more on my Twitter and Substack.
when you look at the Russian Federation today and all that, how do you think like that? Because there are some people who say that Putin is controlled by these elitists, but we all know that he's not. Like that's just a load of nonsense. How do you think when you look at the Russian Federation today and how it's just economically growing? How do you look at Putin and how he handled, like, when it came to kicking up the Rothschilds? How has he been able to handle them, like, when it comes to that?
Um, yeah, as to whether or not Putin is controlled by the same sort of global cabal or not. Obviously, I'm aware of those theories, and I take the attitude towards very much kind of the attitude towards Putin that I take towards Trump. I don't know like who's really pulling the strings, and he also is a very contradictory guy. He'll do something that's incredibly great, and I'm like, yay, Putin! This is fantastic, and then he'll do things that are like not so great, and I'm like, well,
Hello?
maybe there's something else going on. And so you don't know. I'm here.
Yeah, no, just
I
keep
can hear
going.
you.
Sorry about that. The audio just went a bit. Yep.
Yeah, no. So, um, but I think if you look at what he does, you got to say there's more W's than L's, right? And he's definitely net. He is a very positive force for progress and change and sort of moving in the right direction. And and I think it's so important. I think your ideological and philosophical and religious assumptions about how the world works are so crucial to to your positions on this, because so as a com- really really firmly believing Christian, I very much believe that what really influences events on Earth and in the lives of men are these two countervailing forces of God and the devil, right? And they can make things happen that to us will strike us as like completely irrational and illogical and magical. And how did that happen? I don't get it. And I think people who don't have faith, uh, if they're not allowing for this supernatural intervention in human affairs, they will always look for rational, humanistic explanations. Like Putin did this thing, so that must mean that he's like part of the cabal, um, or he did that thing, that must show that he's a really good guy. But what if God is moving things in a certain way, or he's allowing the devil to move things in a certain way because of a greater sort of spiritual world happening out there? So that's very much the way I look at it. And I think I would say the same thing about America. And I really, honestly, 110% believe that the only thing that's going to make the world get better, and that includes Russia and includes the West, is if people turn to Christianity. And to the extent they turn away from it, things are going to end up disastrously. And so the only question is, does Russia have a bright future? Well, yeah, if it continues on this Christian path that it's started out on, but it still has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of anti-Christian stuff going on in Russia. And so, it's very contradictory. There's these countervailing forces in Russian society, which are like some are Christian and some aren't, and sort of the spiritual battle goes on. And it's the same in America. There's some very Christian elements of American society and life and everything, civilization, and there's some horribly anti-Christian ones, and they also sort of are like butting heads, right? And where this all ends up and how we all end up is depends really on the faith of each one of us, of like the spiritual decisions we make. And so it doesn't depend on Mr. Trump or Mr. Putin or Mr. Rothschild or some Netanyahu or some cabal or devious people. It depends on you and me and what's happening in our hearts.
When I look at Putin, I think he's like one of the best leaders there's ever been. I think he's the best leader, in Russian history for to take Russia from an economic dump, to free it a lot from the Rothschild influence, to kick out a lot of the corruption in the Kremlin, take it from like this to the fourth biggest economy, like in people's purchasing power. Like I think when you look at the future right now, especially with BRICS and how the dollar is losing its power, which it is, I think Russia, like China, is going to be the world superpower soon, but I do believe Russia is going to be the second world superpower under the BRICS system, which is going to be fantastic. Charles, when you went to the BRICS summit, right? Correct. You went there to the BRICS summit.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. When
Yeah.
you were at the BRICS summit, as your experience in living in Russia, um, when you were there in the summit, what was it like to feel, like meeting all of these journalists? And what do you say to the people who say that Russia has no freedom of speech? It's a dictatorship, all that nonsense from the Western media.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Kazan was fascinating because there was all this excitement about, the BRICS are really emerging and things are taking off. And so there was a very large international media presence, and it was great in that respect. Um, this question of freedom of speech is an actually super interesting one because listen, I'm a huge fan of Russia and a huge fan of Putin, and I agree with you that, Putin might be the best world leader that's come along in ages, right? But but it's not correct to say that there is, more freedom of speech in Russia than there is in America. In fact, there's demonstrably less. And it's interesting. In Europe, there isn't so much. There's less freedom of speech than in America, and I would compare freedom of speech levels in Russia more with Europe. It reminds me more of a European situation than an American. And America is just in this respect an historical anomaly, simply because of the accident that they stuck in that Constitution right at number one. This thing that is just inherently super popular, and nobody's been able to get rid of it. And there, I would, you could never say the things about the Russian government that people say against the American government. You could never have a Tucker Carlson in Russia, uh, you know, crapping on the way he crapped on Biden, every day for 4 years. That would never go down in Russia. They'd never allow that to happen. So it, it's you don't get in trouble here for like expressing your personal opinions, right? You can sit around the kitchen table or in the bar and say anything you want, pretty much. Um, but if you start a Telegram channel and it gets really popular and big, and then you start really making a difference in terms of changing people's minds about the government, you'll get a knock on the door, and they'll say, "Knock it off." So, but that doesn't bother me. I don't care.
What about when it comes to media freedom? Because it seems to me like there's a lot more media freedom in Russia. What did you think about that when, in your experience of working in Russian media?
No, I don't think that's true. It's pretty. I mean, by American standard, is much more straitjacketed. I mean, it's straitjacketed the same way, like in the same way that the mainstream media in America was straitjacketed. Now you've got this like explosion of like, you know, Overton window. Basically, go out there and say anything you want. Nothing's off limits, and that's what's basically driving all this positive stuff in America. It's not so much Trump. It's this technological revolution which has opened up free speech in a way that just was not possible 20, 30 years ago. And with all these people waking up and saying things to big audiences that are changing the way people think, it's absolutely extraordinary. So anyway, in Russia, it's not. There's a fair amount of free discussion, kind of like there is in Europe, but you know, it has a lot to do with the fact that Russia's at war. I very much believe that if your country's at war, you should not criticize it, unless you really think it's evil. And if you're like, it's the Vietnam War, and you're convinced that this is a horrible war and
Mhm.
everything like that. But like for example, as a journalist living here in Russia during the SVO, um, I was uh, thinking, wow, this is great. I'm a journalist and I'm here and it's a war. I mean, this is like the subject that I should really write about. But when I thought about it more deeply, I was like, you know what? This doesn't make me entirely comfortable, because if I really wanted to tell the truth, and journalists are supposed to be difficult, curmudgeonly, skeptical, the ones who are asking the awkward questions. So to be a really good, honest journalist writing about the SVO, I'd have to criticize the government a little bit when I thought it was appropriate. I mean, the Russian government isn't perfect, and the Russian armed forces aren't perfect. And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't want to do that, because in a way that undermines their efforts. It's not like my reporting is going to make them change anything, and it'll just get used by Russia's enemies overseas, because I read in English, um, saying, "Hey, look, see, even the pro-Russian guys are saying, it's not going well, or whatever, or people are making mistakes, or there's corruption in the armed services, and so on and so forth." I, and so I don't believe, I totally understand. Let me put it this way: if your country's in a war, and you basically agree with the justness of that war, and you believe in the justness of your country's position and what they're doing, I don't think it's probably, it's not always a good idea to criticize them, because you could be undermining their efforts. And of course, wars are horrible things where people make terrible mistakes, and there's corruption and incompetence, and all kinds of things happen that should be called out, and sometimes they should be, even in a war, right? But it very much has to be like depend on who you are, whether that's going to make a difference, or is that information going to be used against the country that you support. Um, anyway, I don't know how I got on this tangent, but uh, it's it's much more nuanced than you might think, and until you're really in that situation as a journalist, and you're like, do I really want to talk about this? Um, and also, then as a foreigner, living here, I also don't feel it's my place to be criticizing the Russian government. I mean, I think that's the duty of more of your own citizens. Who should really criticize, for example, corruption in the armed forces should be the mainstream journalists in Russia, but they don't do that. So that's interesting.
In your experience of working in Russian media, what do you think that the Russian media does better than the corporate media in America and in Europe?
Well, it's interesting. I couldn't really say. I would say that in general, um, I would say Russian journalistic sort of practice and culture is not as good as uh, Western. If you're talking about the Western ideal, like the great moments of journalism in the West over the last 100 years. And I think that partially has to do with the fact that the profession was so completely neutered and wrecked during the Soviet experience. It was just totally muzzled. And so I think certain traditions are hard to bring back. And so you see a lot of sloppiness in Russian journalism that you'd be like, this wouldn't fly in the West. And I'm not talking about, just sort of going with the flow, or not talking about, awkward questions. I'm
But you
talking about just
you have
basically
found it you have
technical
found it
efficiency.
you have found it to be more truthful than a lot of Western media.
That's true, but only because the position of the Russian government is more truthful.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's. I'm not a big fan of Russian mainstream media. They're kept very much in line. They kind of toe the line, and and then in terms of just like their technical level of like how meticulously they keep after facts and do things, it's not as good as when it's good in the West. Um, so I would say the West is better in that respect. But again, in the ideal, obviously the Western mainstream medium is media is a complete joke, right? Because they're basically directed by people who are instructing them to tell lies, and then the governments on top of that who are also encouraging this behavior. So it's like, it's awful. So in that respect, yeah, Russia's better because the Russian government, I think, is basically on the side of truth on a lot of these issues. And so, yeah, in that sense, the Russian mainstream media is more truthful. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, Charles, how do you see like the Ukraine-Russia conflict ending? Do you see like there potentially being a military coup, like where the CIA and the FBI and most just to decide to remove the Lizinski, or do you think that there will be a peace done? And yeah, there will be a peace deal done between Trump and Putin. How do you see it ending, in your opinion?
Okay. I'll tell you, I have this as I've gained experience in the journalistic profession. I think journalists, there's like one whopping problem that they suffer from, is that they're asked questions like that, and then they feel like, gee, if I don't give like a pretty like specific answer, like I you know can say that what I think is going to happen, I'm going to look stupid. And so the phrase they need to become more comfortable with saying is, I really don't know. I just don't know. And so that's the first answer I'd give to that question. But uh, but I can actually say some things, some general things about the way I think it's going to go. Um, I think that the basic truth of the military facts on the ground are that it is very costly in terms of lives and also destroyed infrastructure to take these Ukrainian cities one by one, right? And one of the reasons it's been going so slowly is because I think the Russians are just trying their best to not to like indiscriminately sacrifice men for relatively small gains. And with all this new technology and this NATO, drone stuff and everything like that, I mean, they could just hold up the Russians for a long time. So yeah, Russia could take Ukraine either by obliterating it and wrecking it completely, which would be against their interests because they think of it as part of their own country, and the people living there as their own brothers. So they're kind of like in a jam, but they can certainly keep up what they're doing for a very long time. Um, and But I think like the power politics of the real situation is that, considering the willpower of the West, is that the Russians are basically going to come to a deal with the Americans that is going to end the thing, and that it will basically achieve what Russia's main goal is they just do not want uh, any kind of potentially militarily aggressive force in Ukraine. They do not want an anti-Russian government there that's hostile to Russia, that hates Russia, that hates Russians and the Russian culture and language and everything like that. And I think their basic terms are going to be with the Americans. Look, we'll settle the line where it is, or kind of near where it is, or whatever. Like, that's not that important. What's really important is that the government that's in there, uh, Zelensky goes, the government that's in there is neutral. All right, it's not anti-Russian. It doesn't have to be anti-West either. It can just be like an Austria or something, like Austria used to be in the Cold War, or Finland, and that we'll have friendly relations, and that the civil rights of ethnic Russians and Russian language and all this stuff will be gone, and this stupid fake neo-Nazi astroturf neo-Nazi morons will be gone, and I'm sure they can agree to that. I don't see that America's really got a problem with that. I mean, in its current Trump phase.
What is your opinion on, speaking about Ukraine and Russia? What is your opinion on the Middle East? Do you feel like that we are going to see like Israel end somehow? Like, a lot of people have been talking about its collapse, like, because we all know that the world's turning on them, the world's waking up to their lies. Or do you think that we're very close to an Israel-Iran war? How do you see the Palestine-Israel conflict going in the future? How do you see it?
Okay, well, so you know what? I think you just asked the most important question of this whole conversation, and it it is so much a philosophical, religious worldview based thing. So I've been thinking a lot about this, what's going on in Gaza, and I just can't believe it. I think it is so. I mean, it's obviously awful, right? But there's like weird there's sort of a weird quality to the awfulness. It's have you ever considered how strange it is that this is going on? But it's happening in the age of smartphones and social media, and the Palestinians, for all their setbacks and things they don't have, somehow they're able to like get these images out, and that all around the world, people, middle class, regular folks who go about their day and take care of their jobs and their families and their lawns and God knows what else. When they scroll through their media feed, they're like seeing these blown up children and dismembered children and weeping parents and this has never happened before in the history of like grisly conflicts. And it's never gone on this long. I mean, usually some like horrific like atrocity happens. I don't know, like Dresden in like World War II, right? Well, that lasted 3 days. This has been going on for like how's that now? What's like a year and a half, right? Are we year and a half? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, year and a half. Yeah.
Um, that's weird. And and like because I have a Christian understanding of what's happening, when I see stuff like that happen, I don't just like dismiss it. Oh, that's just a coincidence. Oh, it's technology, whatever. I'm like, no, wait a minute. There's a reason why this is happening this way, because it's forcing people to make a decision in their own hearts. You cannot, you cannot. I mean, you when you look at that stuff, you've got to say something or not say something, or like you've got to react somehow. You can't. You're not just a slab of stone, right? You're going to be either like, well, this is too awful, I can't think about it, and just like shove it in a pigeonhole, or you could look at it and say, I just can't stand for this, and you'll go out and demonstrate on the street, or you'll start posting on social media about it, or you'll look at it and say, well, good for them, those damn, terrorists. I hope they get all slaughtered or something like that. Anyway, you can have all these different reactions. But and this is like this incredible spiritual test of all of us, because it's incredibly harmful for a certain type of person in the prosperous, comfortable West, and I guess also in the Middle East, and also lots of other places around the world. If you come out and you harshly criticize this and start getting down to the actual like deeper sort of forces in the world that are allowing this to happen, it gets very, very ugly, and it's going to be very bad for your business. If you're a dentist, and you're just basically hanging in there with your practice and everything, you might lose 10% of your clients, and you might have to shut down your company. If you talk about it, your kid might not get into college that he wants to go to. You might not get the promotion in your firm that you wanted. And so it's like this weird test, right? It's like, wait a minute, this is shoved in my face. I've got to do something here. But if I do the right thing, I will be hurt materially. And what's so amazing is that so many people are making the wrong decision. That's the terrifying thing. I feel like a tear's gonna roll down my cheek. That's how like my voice is breaking up, but it's true. That's what's happening.
I Charles, I understand how you feel. Like some of those photos I've seen, it's disgusting. Like what Israel was doing is absolute inhumane, and it's absolute. But if you want to cry, mate, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually powerful, mate. It's like,
I prefer not to cry, in front of a lot of people. But
oh,
anyway,
mate, it's fine. It's
you can
fine.
feel the emotion in my voice. It's not
Yeah,
an
yeah,
easy thing to talk about. It's like what in God's name is happening?
yeah.
And yeah, so I think this is like it's like this incredible test. And because, again, to follow up with the Christian sort of analysis of all this, so what I think is that those little Palestinian children, they're innocent. If there was ever an innocent thing in the world, it's a little child, right? And also a lot of the Palestinians themselves are innocent, right? So they're being basically sacrificed. They're, the things that are making like the middle class American or European like turn his head away and try and ignore it and not think about it and not raise his voice or cause a fuss. That's basically sin on the part of those people. It's Christian. It's the Christian understanding of sin, and so those innocent people in Gaza are carrying those sins.
Yeah.
They're going straight to heaven. That and they're doing it with such incredible human dignity. When you look at these people, first of all, I noticed it's they seem to be physically so attractive. Maybe it's because they don't have like a lot of like crappy Western diet that makes people bloated and ugly or something, and they don't get enough to eat, and so they're sort of slim, and sort of this natural beauty comes out. But I just see that they're like the innocent lambs that are carrying away the sins of the world. In other words, the sins of those people in countries that are in a position to do something to stop this. And that's how I see this, what's going on. And I think it's an incredible test by God. And it's kind of like he's kind of shoving it in our face and saying, this is where you've brought the world. This is like where world civilization is at. Not only this can happen, because terrible things like this have happened in the past, but this one's different because we're going to shove it in your face every single day for 400 days. Okay, and you still haven't stood up and done something about it. So that's an incredible human crisis that's happening, like a moral crisis that's happening, and it's bizarre. That's what I think about it.
One thing I find that's very scary is how in America you can have how when you learn about the Federal Reserve history, you learn about the greatest city of London, etc., Khazaria, the Illuminati, the Jesuits, etc. And it's just so ridiculous how you can have these Christians you may have different opinion on Trump, and that's fine. How Trump, Jared Kushner, how he wants to build the real estate in Palestine, which we all know he wants to do that by genociding them. How you have so many of these Christians who follow Judo Christianity, which is not really Christianity, it's fake Christianity, mostly New Age Christianity. And also you have them following the Schofield Bible, that when they say that Israel's our greatest friend, it's our greatest ally, but yet you have a land of Israel that follows an ideology that persecutes Christians, that hates Christians, hates Muslims, and it's the same type of ideology that the people who killed Christ follow, which is Talmudicism. By the way, I don't think Talmudicism is true Judaism. I think it's fake Judaism, because a lot of true Jews don't like what's happening. A lot of true Jews are very good people. They hate what's happening, and yeah, it's just, and the fact that they're going to be bringing in this anti-Semitic law. By the way, Charles, I'm just going to say this, guys. I just want to say this is a shout out to Generation X girl. She is, have you heard of her, Charles? Generation X girl.
No, I don't know who that is.
Oh, she is absolutely fantastic. She obviously has different beliefs to us, but she does something where she exposes a lot. She was like one of the first people who broke the anti-Semitic act, and she talks about it. And she just does absolutely, I'll send you a link to her, shout out to her, and she does an absolutely fantastic job of talking about the anti-Semitic act, the Israel lobby, AIPAC, and all that. And it's fantastic. And she was one of the people who woke me up to this, and just seeing that, and not to mention, what was I going to say? Also the just the fact that they're trying to make a bill to make it illegal to criticize, the state of Israel and make Bible quotes illegal. I think it's just backfiring on them. And you're right, it is going to backfire. Even if, Charles, they do pass that law and it ends freedom of speech in America, I don't think they're going to last. Because how I look at this, I think, Charles, that in a way, something's going to happen with America where there will be an uprising. But I do think America will go for an economic collapse or probably a civil war. But I think it will rise up again, and maybe America, in order to get there, has to go through what Russia did in the 90s. And that, like you said, it's like how you talk about, the test, like how God is thrown. So yes, so that's what I'm saying. But I just think it's disgusting. Going back to it, I just think it's absolutely insane how it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist, you're like Muslim or Jew, even atheists, even leftists, hate what Israel's doing to Palestine. And I mean,
Yeah.
there's a girl called Anna from the Young Turks, and she thinks it's disgusting. I mean, we've got totally different beliefs to her, and she thinks it's messed up. It's just and
Well, listen, no, yeah, because it just confronts like just the most elementary universal human feeling of justice and decency. So yeah, I totally understand why people who are like have nothing, no, are not Christians or don't even like Christianity would be repulsed and deeply deeply upset by what's going on. It's
And Charles,
um,
I find it so ridiculous because a lot of these pro-Israel American people, like follow the Schofield Bible and Judah Christianity, they need to read the Talmud. I mean, look what the Talmud says about Jesus. It says that Jesus is like burning in hell in poo. You
yeah.
have like, all of that stuff. Mary was this. Sorry if that offends you, Charles. I know that you're
No, so,
Christian.
no,
Sorry if
no,
that
no,
offends you.
I'm familiar with that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah,
Let me say something, Welsh, about those pro-Israeli Christians.
yeah.
Most people will believe what their authority figures tell them, because most people are busy holding down their jobs, taking care of their families, mowing their lawns, and so on. So, so if they're going to a church and the pastor keeps drumming that into their head every Sunday, they're gonna be like, yeah, I guess so. It's probably true. He should know. That's his job. And if most of their friends think that, and I live in America. I live in a pretty provincial spot in Pennsylvania. It's called Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Some of the viewers might be familiar with it because it's the heart of the Amish country, the original Amish country, and it's very Amish. But anyway, it's a real kind of what we call churchy in that part of the world. Everybody goes to church, and most people are these kind of like Bible believing Christian Protestants. And I've talked to so many of them there about this, the Schofield sort of thing about supporting Israel, and they really believe it. And they're good people. I know these people. They're like neighbors and friends, and you see them like
Yeah, they
around,
are good people. I know what
you
you
know,
mean. I mean,
and
yeah,
these are not people, who have got some kind of like big sort of evil thing going in their life. They're just completely hoodwinked. And but the thing is that look, the media they watch, the Christian TV they watch, reinforces it. The Christian radio they listen to
mm,
reinforces it. Their pastor reinforces it. Their neighbors believe it. Their whatever their social circles or something. They're not watching the YouTube channels explaining why it's a bunch of BS. And I think people are very much sort of like they're easy to manipulate, really, and that's why like the job of like people who are in a position of forming opinions is such a responsible. It's this huge responsibility, right? And and one of the reasons why this has just become such like a rampant like a sort of brainwashing success for the state of Israel is not necessarily the Schofield Bible itself, although that was part of it, but basically what they started doing after World War II is they would the Israeli state and Jewish lobbies would create massive financial
mm,
benefits to pastors who really push this hard, and to Christian media that push this hard, and so it was a financial material corruption process where they would do things in a way that they'd get the good book deal, and they'd be able to buy the TV station, and they'd get junkets to the Holy Land, bring all your parishioners, and hey, you need a cheap loan, yeah, we can arrange that. This kind of thing, like this sort of soft financial lobbying that eventually created these very wealthy, TV pastors who were basically selling their soul to the devil, but getting paid extremely handsomely for it. So that's really the mechanism of how it works. And instead of going after the Scofield Bible, people should be hammering away at these multimillionaire pastors who make a very good business doing this because they continue to get financial support from Jewish interests in the state of Israel. And if you could dismantle that and get people in their place teaching people something else, people would wake up very quickly.
Not to mention the last true president of America, which many people think he was the last true president of America, John F. Kennedy. What happened to him? He wanted AIPAC to register as a foreign agent again? Foreign agent, right? The Foreign Agent Act. And he wanted to end the Federal Reserve. And he was also, wanting to stop the nuclear technology, like Israel wanting to. And look what happened to him. He got killed because of that, because he dared to speak out against that.
I completely agree with that.
Also, it was just because he had the nuclear. What was the stuff with the nuclear with him and the Ben Kavir? Sorry, Charles. I believe, if they do ever release the John F. Kennedy files, I don't think they will. I don't think they will. I think if Trump did, if he decided to release it, what I think would happen is, by the way, this guy called Matthew Tower on Twitter, he has a great Twitter post of an edited Twitter post, and it says something in 2030. It's revealed that who was the president of Israel at that time? The prime minister, something called Ben something.
Yeah, I'm forgetting it.
Yeah, Ben, the prime minister turns
Ben Gurion.
Yeah, turns out Ben Gurion ordered. I would not be surprised if it said, "Oh, Ben Gurion ordered the hit on John F. Kennedy." Because he was calling out this and upsetting them or something. But we're never going to see the John F. Kennedy files come out. We never will. It's not going to come out, I don't think.
But, well, so here's the thing. You should never say that because you honestly, you don't know.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And neither do I. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that's happening now in America, if you had asked me a year ago, what do you think the likelihood of that happening is? I'd be extremely low, less than 5%. So, sometimes things work in a way you just never expected, and
exactly.
Why bother trying to predict stuff and either be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic? Just there's no way to tell. Let's just wait and see what happens. I mean, I'm not gonna, I'm a big believer in this in a life philosophy of not crossing a stream until you get to it. Right? It doesn't make any sense. It's not a practical way to spend your time. So whenever I can't tell what's really going to happen, not a lot of visibility on that. Sorry to say. And when it happens, and then we'll see. So that's how I look at it.
Charles, before we finish up, what is the last thing you would like to say? And do you have any quote from Orthodox Christianity you want to give to your audience who feel like giving up and feel who are down and out in life? Go.
I'm glad you asked me that question because I've been very lazy about this podcast, and I had no idea who you were. And thanks also for sticking with it so long, because it took us a month of 3 or 4 attempts to schedule it, and so nothing pays off like persistence. Well, anyway, so literally a half hour before we started, I looked at your YouTube channel and your Twitter feed and everything like that, trying to get a sense of where you're coming from, and I read your testimony about your struggle with depression, drugs, and autism. And I want to say, everybody who's stuck with this broadcast this far, if you if you haven't done so, go to the YouTube channel, and it's in the description. It is such a moving thing, and I want to applaud you not only for doing that, but also expressing it so well. Let's see. In terms of an Orthodox or a Christian quote that I'd want to share with people that I think is super important, Um, Again, you keep throwing these like impossible choice options at me. I'm like, what do I even start? Not that I even got them in my head, but there is one thing that does come to mind, which is relevant to our discussion about what we were talking about Gaza, right? So, and I won't be able to give you an exact quote. I'm going to paraphrase what Jesus said. But Jesus said, um, he very often interchangeably uh, described himself as the truth. He would say, I am the truth, like it was his name or his identity or something, right? But then in other places, he said things like this. He would say, you know, um, in speaking up for me, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be ostracized, uh, you might be physically damaged or even killed. And when that happens, you should never, never back down. You should just keep, uh, testifying to me. And so the way I look at that in my personal understanding of Christianity is he was basically saying, listen, just always tell the truth. And even when it gets really bad, like when you're just going to get thrown in the slammer, you're going to get your head chopped off, you're going to get your hand chopped off or something like that. It's like, just let it go. Like, just say the truth. And so that's what people are not doing about this Gaza thing. And so that's how it's relevant to what we were talking about. And that's what I would uh, I would just encourage people. Like, yeah, you might take a hit. Yeah, it might get really bad. You might lose your house. Uh, your marriage might break up, or you might get kicked out of your club, or I don't know what's like important for you, right? But don't let that determine whether you speak the truth or not. Just make it your like ironclad rule in life to speak the truth. Not always, because sometimes it's strategic. It's strategic to say to sort of play along for a while, and then speak the truth when it's going to have the most effect or something like that. But still, when it matters, when it's on the line, and when you can make a difference, even if it's going to hurt you, and this has happened so many times in my life, just tell the truth, and you'll be fine, and things will work out great, even if you get killed for it. Okay, but that's what you should do. So that would be my final thought.
Well, thank you for joining us, Charles. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. Where can people find you?
Um, I write about Russia and partially about the moving to Russia experience on Substack, and I'm on Twitter. So, yeah.
Well, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure having you, Charles. I really enjoyed. It was a great conversation we had. And I just want to say to everybody, thank you for joining the Watch Podcast episode 165. Go check out Charles's work. He does a great job, a lot of interesting interviews. He has a great page. And yeah, and if you want to move to Russia, you can learn a lot about it for reading his Substack and a lot of other things, which is great. So take care, everybody. God bless you all. Stay safe. Remember to like and subscribe. So yeah, take care, everybody. God bless you all. Stay safe.